So if you're like most drivers, you can probably spot some pretty bad driving when you see it. Things like someone texting while they're driving. You might see them swerving in and out of the lane. Sometimes you might see people change lanes without really checking their blind spot and they end up cutting someone else off in traffic. And for me, my all-time pet peeve is when people are driving in the far left passing lane and they're not actually passing anyone. They're just kind of camped out there in that lane, driving below the speed limit with miles of clear lane ahead of them. Bad driving habits everywhere. And usually these things happen because people aren't really aware of their surroundings, or they're just not aware of the proper etiquette or the unspoken rules for the road. But the outcome is always the same. These bad habits adversely impact those around them. And again, most of us know how to spot them really easily. You might even have your own list of pet peeves as well. But while you can spot bad habits of others really well, you might not be as aware of some of the bad habits that you do, or maybe you just tend to think that they don't impact or offend others as much as they really do. That's what this chapter is about. And clearly we're not talking about driving, but really the bad habits that you do when you're fighting with your spouse in conflict. Now, you might be able to pinpoint with stunning clarity all the things that your spouse is doing wrong. As you go through this chapter, you might be able to say, yep, they do that, and they do that, and they do that. But the point of this chapter is to help you to evaluate yourself and to see from a fresh perspective some of the things that you might be doing to cause damage to your marriage. As it is with most bad habits in life, it takes time and repetition to unlearn them, but it also takes awareness of when you're doing it, admitting that you're doing it, and building the disciplines to stop doing it. So to keep things as simple as possible, I'll cover this topic in two sections. First, bad fighting habits people do when they're initiating a fight, and then second, bad habits that people do when they're responding to others who have issues with them in a fight. Okay, let's start with how we speak in conflict. Now, if you recall from the last chapter, a lot of communicating well in conflict when that lower brain is triggered depends on how well we regulate and process the emotional flow of what we're experiencing. So a lot of poor communication stems from bad regulation and voicing unprocessed content in a fight. Now, there's a few ways that this typically shows up in a fight. First is what's called spewing. Now, that could range from anything like a not so loud yet aggressive manipulation or control of an argument to a very loud and out of control rage of hurtful words and behaviors. If we go back to that imagery of a dam, spewing usually means that the dam that holds that reservoir of emotions like anger, pain, and fear overflows and breaks down, resulting in things being said and done that are far more hurtful and damaging than good. So when this happens, a lot of emotional content gets communicated, but it's completely raw and unprocessed, making it extremely difficult for the recipient or the listener to really follow and understand. The receiver might hear a bunch of words coming out of your mouth, but they won't really be able to understand what you're really trying to tell them, or more likely, they'll be too defensive to really hear you out. You see, when you spew, you have to have that last word, to say that one more thing and to respond to that last comment. And the really hard thing is that it feels completely right at the time, like you're fighting for justice and truth, like you're fighting against wrongs done to you or to others. But if all you're really trying to do in a spew session is to be right or to extract your pound of flesh, then chances are that the person you're speaking to isn't likely to really listen to anything that you have to say. All they're going to hear are attacks, and they're going to tune you out, which means nothing you say, regardless of how aggressive or loud or even logical and rational you try to be, nothing will actually get through to them, leaving you without feeling understood, which in turn means no resolution. And if you think about it, that's really the whole point of a conflict, or at least it should be, to gain understanding and resolution. But if all you're doing is spewing to get stuff off your chest or to win a fight, the only real objective that you're accomplishing is feeling better in that moment, but at the very cost expense of causing damage to your relationship, and certainly not in order to get actual resolution to your conflict. You see, spewers express themselves mostly to release their frustration or to satisfy whatever primal urge that they're feeling at that time, to say whatever that is that they're thinking without caring any more about the consequences to their words. At that point of flooding, it's no longer about being understood or finding resolution, and it's certainly not about what's best for the relationship. It's about satisfying selfish wants that end in damage to the marriage. Now, if this describes you, you might genuinely think that you're trying to get understood or to find resolution to deeply frustrating issues, but you also likely know that how you communicate when you spew only results in more hurt feelings and things you have to clean up after the fact. And if you can stop to observe that that's the usual outcome, that there's damage afterwards, then you have to ask yourself if how you speak when you're fighting is really about getting understanding and resolution, or if it's more about satisfying your impulses when you're in that lower brain flooded state. The general principle to remember here is people don't care about what you have to say until you start putting some care into how you say it. And conversely, if you don't put enough care and effort into how you say things, you might not care all that much about gaining resolution to your issues as you are about satisfying your impulsive desires in that moment of conflict. Now, the second most common bad habit people tend to do when communicating a fight is kind of the opposite, and it's what's called stuffing. Stuffing could mean something as intentional as biting your tongue and not saying anything when you clearly have a conflict brewing. It could also look like shutting down emotionally and being so detached emotionally that you might not even be aware that a conflict within you is happening. Sufferers withhold themselves from conflict. Sometimes it's because they fear conflict and where it could lead. Things could get heated and out of control. Sometimes it's because they doubt their own voice and they feel guilty when they speak up. And other times they just flat out don't know what to say or have the right words to use. So while shutting down and avoiding a conflict provides a short-term solution to the fight, the long-term problem is that emotional reservoir that holds all those emotions just gets bigger and bigger over time. At some point, that dam breaks and a spew happens, or even worse, that person starts falling into a state of depression or anxiety because their emotions start to collapse inward and they shut down due to a huge backlog of unprocessed emotions and conflict. Now, the third most common bad fighting tactic is somewhere in between, and it's what I call leaky communication. So instead of spewing or stuffing issues in a fight, this fighting habit looks like a person leaking out their issues in the form of passive-aggressive anger. Passive-aggressive or leaky communication usually happens when a person is frustrated enough to make side comments here and there, but they're also probably not very clear on what they're actually frustrated about, which is why leakers don't engage conflict directly. They're not sure or confident in their voice, so they opt to use passive-aggressive words to express their frustration, but in unprocessed and in ways that are indirect. If this describes you, then more than likely you're not regulating and processing your emotions well enough to get a firm handle on your issues in conflict. But then there are also times people leak because it's actually an intentional form of manipulation or a tactic in conflict. They know that they're able to communicate indirectly to convey their displeasure, but without having to actually run the risk or to go through the effort of having direct conflict about their issue. The objective is to hope that people will just get it and act differently without actually having to tell them anything directly. Now, if this describes you, then understand that you might be able to achieve behavioral change, getting your spouse to do things different, but you're also paying a hefty price. Because while you might be getting behavioral changes, you're not really getting understanding or real resolution to your issues. And your spouse is likely building up resentment towards you that will end up being leaked back on you, or they might even spew their frustration out on you at some point. Just know, you might be thinking that you're helping the marriage by not spewing, but leaking can be as damaging, if not more so, because of how issues can build up over time. Now, the next common bad habit is what's called negative assumption or projection. Now, bear with me here. I know that sounds really complicated, but I can assure you, you probably already know what it is and you can probably spot it when you see it. Let me explain how this plays out. When you get triggered in a conflict, your lower brain that kicks in to start the flooding process grabs onto past experiences to help you evaluate and assess the threat in a fight as quickly as possible. For example, if you grew up in a home where raised voices meant that someone was going to get hurt, maybe even physically, then it's likely that hearing raised voices in a conflict today is going to cause you to assume or project a threat that feels more severe than it possibly really is. In other words, your past hurts, whether hurts from your spouse or hurts from others, will come back quickly to color and inform the way you interpret the trigger for a conflict today. Now, on one hand, this helps you make quick judgments so that you can react quickly. But on the other hand, this can and oftentimes leads to faulty assumptions and projections of past hurts into present situations, especially in marital situations where there's plenty of room for misunderstandings. Now, the next chapter on accounting for past hurts and injuries will go much more in depth on this issue. For now, just know negative assumptions and projections are a common culprit for repetitive conflicts that seem to happen over and over again and can quickly sabotage your fights in a marriage. All right, the next bad fighting habit is what I call parental invalidation and criticism. In short, it's when people use a parental "what's wrong with you" kind of tone. That could sound like criticism that conveys never good enough, or some level of invalidation that conveys you're stupid, or your thinking is stupid, or your feelings are stupid. I call these parental tones because when someone uses these tactics, it's usually an attempt to gain power over their spouse by tearing them down, placing themselves in some sort of higher position of authority or a more parental role. This might also look like what's known today as gaslighting, where one spouse calls into question the other spouse's ability to reason and to see things clearly. Again, this is just another form of a power play that ultimately seeks to gain control or an advantage over another person. Now, people do this for a number of various different reasons. Sometimes it's because they lack respect for their spouse that causes them to see their spouse as less than them. Sometimes they're not entirely secure in themselves and tend to tear down their spouse in order to feel more secure and better about themselves. A lot of times, though, it can often just be that they don't know how to articulate themselves without using parental and judgmental tones. See, it's common for people to use this tactic because that's the tone and voice that their own parents used with them as a child when there was a conflict or when they were troubled. So naturally, when faced with a conflict today as an adult, it makes sense for people to use tones that they're already familiar with as a way to convey themselves in high-stress conflict. Now, the last bad habit in fighting is when people communicate with a consistent undertone of contempt and resentment. This is when you see your spouse and communicate to them as though they've done you a great harm, and your words try to convey some kind of emotional debt that they owe you. So not only do you see them as doing wrong things, you see them as being wrong as a person, and you hold resentment towards them because of it. Like who they are as someone that is wrong and morally questionable, and you filter your words and actions through that perception, and you speak to them in conflict that way. Now, for a lot of marriages that have suffered a great deal of pain and damage, this isn't an uncommon position to be in. I mean, imagine having to suffer through an infidelity. It's hard for someone who is cheated on to not see their spouse through such a lens. But unless something is done to heal and mend the hurt, communication that continues to be distorted by such levels of deep-seated contempt and resentment will end up causing way more damage down the line. Now, if this describes you or your spouse, we'll get into tactically things that you can do to start mending those hurts in chapters 8 and 9. But just know, special attention has to be given to address and resolve these kinds of resentments. Otherwise, your marriage will continuously be poisoned from the inside out, and no amount of improvement in your communication and conflict skills is going to help overcome that. Okay, that's it for right now in this first section on bad habits when you're the initiator of conflict. In the next section, we'll dig into some bad habits when you're the one responding in conflict.